and she's going to start us off. So I'll let Carla take it away. This is her first journal club presentation as a geriatric medicine
Yes.
resident. So thank you, Carla.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to present. Today, we'll be discussing the paper titled Assessing Risk for Adverse Outcome in Older Adults, the need to include both physical frailty and cognition. Frailty is a complex geriatric syndrome that I think has caused a lot of debate in terms of trying to define it. It is quite common. It is estimated that about 10 to 15% of older adults living in the community are frail. And historically, the concept of frailty has focused on the physical domain of the syndrome. In general, the frailty phenotype, which was a framework or concept that was developed in the early 2000s, has been published as an adequate measure of vulnerability and has been integrated in several clinical tools. And so I'm sure it's not a surprise to you that studies have also looked at how cognition fits into this frailty framework, and only some frailty instruments actually include the cognitive elements. Cognitive impairment captures an element of vulnerability that is often present in patients who are not physically disabled, but in the presence of a stressor, such as a hospital admission, will develop disability. And the studies to date have suggested that the reduced cognitive reserve represents a risk that is beyond the one identified by the decreased physical reserve. And so looking at how the interaction between mild cognitive impairment and physical frailty sort of work has been a major area of studies and research, and that's what the authors in this study tried to address. The objective was to estimate the effects of combining physical frailty and cognitive impairment without dementia and the risk of basic ADL dependence and death over the span of 8 years. The methods. So the design of this study, this is a prospective cohort study using the HRS study as baseline. So this is the national representative cohort of older adults in the United States. The University of Michigan started this longitudinal study in 1992, and it's continuously ongoing. They have about 20,000 older adults in the community. They conduct basically in-depth interviews every year or every 2 years, and they discuss a wide range of information such as health, social status, economical circumstances as far as the interview. And as of the mid-2000s, they've also started to do physical performance tests to have a bigger picture of who these older adults are and what their outcomes are like. So this particular study looks at that, uses that database. Independent community dwelling individuals over the age of 65 were picked. They're living in the United States without dementia and independent for ADLs at baseline. And the follow-up for this particular study was every 2 years for a total of 8 years. This flowchart basically describes the number of participants. They started with about over 9,000, and after their exclusion criteria, which was ADL dependent at baseline or dementia, those patients or those participants were excluded. They ended up with over 7,000 individuals in the study. In terms of how they define frailty, so they use the frailty score, and where if the participants score more than 3 out of the 5 domains, they were deemed as frail. And they are the unintentional weight loss over 10% in the previous 2 years, exhaustion, muscle weakness, grips, and that was measured by grip strength, the dynamometer, slowness while walking, and that was measured by using a walk test at 8 feet distance, and level of activity, and that was primarily self-reported. In terms of the cognitive assessments that they did, so they used this 27-point scale tool, and the patients who score between 7 and 11 are the ones that they classified as cognitively impaired without dementia. This tool included immediate and delayed recall of 10 nouns, included serial subtraction by 7, and it also included a background count task by 20. Unfortunately, the details of which points were, how the points were distributed were not available. So I was not able to see exactly how they were differentiating which tasks between dementia and cognitive impairment without dementia. But the authors did mention in the text that this particular screening tool for cognition was previously validated in prior studies when they were using this large database, as well as the fact that when it was validated, there was neuropsychological testing and expert opinion to be able to differentiate between cognitive impairment and dementia. And they also make it a point to mention that this is the screening tool that they're currently using as a method to track national trends in the United States for cognitive impairment and dementia. The participants were classified into 4 groups based on their physical frailty and cognitive status into no deficit, participants with only a cognitive impairment, with physical frailty, and cognitive impaired and physically frail. The primary outcomes were 2. Number 1, the time to experience incident of ADL dependence. And participants were actually asked, self-reported basically, whether or not they needed help in one of the 6 ADLs. And this data was obtained in the personal interview, and that data also included the physical performance test. It was not clear to me within the text of this paper how they were able to determine this with the patients with cognitive impairment. However, when looking there's a website for this large database, the HRS database, they do have some of the tools used there, but also they do mention that for the interviews, they try to have one of the caregivers present as well. So, but that wasn't explicitly mentioned on the paper. The second primary outcome was death. And that was the exact date of death was gathered from the National Death Index, from Medicare files, and if not, from the exit interviews that they had with the survivor family. The confounders that the authors identified and selected and accounted for were social demographic characteristics, were comorbidities, and the comorbidities had been shown to affect, to be predictors of mortality in the past, and depression. They actually did have a 3-question depression screen that they used. They also unfortunately didn't show the actual questions, but they did mention that it was previously also used in prior studies, and it was validated. 3 out of an 8-point scale of a depression test deemed the participants susceptible. The data was analyzed using a Cox proportion hazard regression analysis, and they used the competing risk model for their analysis, and we will look at that in a bit more detail. So let's start by looking at the patient demographics or patient characteristics. As you can see here, the total number of participants on the top left column is over 7,000. And in the red box here, you have the number of participants that have physical frailty, so not physically frail and physically frail. So looking at the numbers in the red box and just doing proportion, the prevalence of physical frail adults was 15%. The prevalence of adults with cognitive impairment without dementia was 19%, and both deficits was 5%. That's just doing the calculation. Now, older adults who were physically frail at baseline were more likely to have cognitive impairment without dementia compared to those who were not physically frail. And that is a 36% versus 17%. You can also see from this first part of the chart, the demographics include participants in their mid-70s to late 70s. The proportion of women and men were approximately half. The ethnicity of the participants were primarily white Caucasian, but there were some participants from other ethnic groups. The second part of this chart looks at, one before. Yeah. Oh, my apologies. Somehow
we missed a slide.
We missed the slide. So in the second part of this chart at the bottom, basically of the chart, and I hope you can see my apologies, just shows some correlations, but they did have the comorbidities as well. Summarizing physical frailty status in general was associated with older age, lower educational level, lower socioeconomical status, and comorbidities seem to contribute more than in the non-physical frail population. So table 2, so this table describes the association between physical frailty and cognitive impairment with incidence, disability, and mortality, basically with the primary outcomes. and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this type of table, they have calculated the hazard ratio for the incidence of ADL dependence and mortality with a 95% confidence interval. So you can see here, there are two main groups. So the incidence of ADL dependence and mortality, and you have the unadjusted and adjusted group. For the unadjusted column, the ratio of losing ADLs or dying without the confounders into account is what is reported as the hazard ratio. The adjusted column, and you see the two red boxes there, basically tell us what the ratio is of losing the ADLs or dying, taking these confounders into account, such as age, comorbidities, and social economical status, etc. So after adjusting for the confounders, so just looking at the adjusted columns, physically frail individuals presented with a higher risk of ADL dependence with a subhazard ratio of 1.5, you see that, and death with a hazard ratio of 1.9 compared to those who were non-frail. Similarly, older adults with cognitive impairment without dementia had a risk of incidence for ADL dependence with a subhazard ratio of 1.4 and a hazard ratio of 1.4 as well for those who were for death compared to those who were cognitively intact. So therefore, up to this point, they can conclude that both physical frailty and cognitive status both were independently associated with incidence of ADL dependence and mortality. So moving on to the next graph. In figure 1, oh my bad. Yeah. Figure 1 illustrates the increased cumulative incidence of ADL dependence and death according to the presence of physical frailty and cognitive impairment at baseline. So panel A shows a modified Kaplan-Meier curve for ADL dependence, and these curves were computed and adjusted using the final grade method, basically to consider the competing risk of death, and that was adjusted and accounted for in this graph. And you can see that the participants with no deficit show a less incidence of ADL dependence, as you would expect, and the participants with both deficits show a higher incidence of ADL dependence. Panel B is your very standard Kaplan-Meier curve estimate. And again, it shows that participants without any deficits have less percent of mortality, and participants with both deficits will show a higher percent of mortality. So how about the combined effects of both? So that is illustrated in the next table. This table puts all the variables together to test the actual hypothesis. Note that the normal that we're comparing to is the top row, that is the not frail and cognitive normal individual for reference, for comparison. So testing for both outcomes in both columns, we're just going to look at the adjusted columns. Individuals who were physically frail and cognitively impaired presented the highest risk of incidence for ADL dependence, a subhazard ratio of 2, and also had a higher mortality, a hazard ratio of 2.6, when compared to those who were neither frail nor cognitively impaired. And this was statistically significant. So the authors took it a step further. The authors took it a step further and actually wanted to test whether or not adding cognitive impairment to an already existing model that only incorporated physical frailty would improve the accuracy of the model to actually identify those individuals that were more vulnerable than not. So they used the Herald's concordance statistics, and I'm sure most of you or some of you will be more capable of explaining this in detail than I am. I haven't personally used it, but suffice to say that the higher the C statistic, the more robust the model, the more it will likely predict the outcome. So on the first column under the Herald C statistics, if you add the cognitive measure to a model that already includes the physical frailty alone, that increases the accuracy of the model, identifying those older adults at high risk. So we're comparing 0.74 to 0.71 for identifying incidence of ADL dependence as well as mortality. And that was also statistically significant. The other two columns on the right, the continuous NRI and the IDI, are two other statistical models that confirm the positive impact of their first test when they were using the Herald-C test that helped to measure physical frailty and on outcome discrimination. So with this, we're able to conclude that adding the cognitive impairment improves the already existing model of physical frailty. It makes it more robust, it seems, at predicting someone who might be losing ADLs, and similarly, combining both can predict death better than using physical frailty alone. So the conclusions from this paper are three. The combination of physical frailty with cognitive impairment without dementia identifies the escalating risk of adverse outcomes more accurately than either factor alone. Adding the cognitive measure to models that include physical frailty alone resulted in a statistically and clinically significant increase in recognizing the risk of incidence, disability, and death. And this study shows that cognitive impairment without dementia is a core element of intrinsic vulnerability among older adults that live independent in the community. In terms of the strength of this that I thought this paper had, I thought that this prospective study had a pretty good significant follow-up. It had a pretty robust N as well, using that the database that they had. Also, the statistical analysis I thought was quite robust. They were able to show, at least with the statistics that they performed, that cognitive impairment added some statistical significant discriminatory power to predict some adverse outcomes that are of tools that we already have. Some of the limitations, the authors did mention that there was a high incidence of death in the reference group. They quoted 21%. I wasn't able to find any more details on that, and they didn't really elaborate on that, but that I think could also have an impact on the numbers as they presented. In addition, they had the self-reported exhaustion piece, which was part of, if you recall, of the frailty phenotype, just the physical part, but they also have the same question repeated in the depression screen. So having it twice could have introduced some bias there in the reports. And the cognitive test itself unfortunately wasn't available, and same with the depression scale screening tool that they used. It would have been useful to sort of see. And also, I thought it would have been a bit more practical to maybe use the standard screening tools, such as the MMAC, with the standard cutoffs, just to make it more clinically applicable. In terms of how this applies to our practice and how why I thought this paper was important, I thought this slide already said, okay. This paper highlights to me the importance of identifying and intervening on patients with mild cognitive impairment. It provides data that supports the impact of MCI in the overall health of patients. And importantly as well, it emphasizes the need of having a comprehensive framework to approach frailty. Particularly important to our colleagues that are dealing with more older adults than previous years, services like ours, the surgical services or the oncology services that are trying to risk stratify patients before high-risk procedures or before systemic chemotherapy, for example. The bottom line, just summarize, is that mild cognitive impairment is a core element of intrinsic vulnerability among older adults living independently in the community, and it should be considered when determining frailty. I would like to thank Dr. Alvai for his always being so generous in terms of discussion of papers and advice, and also Halamadi for the useful discussions on the stats. And thank you.
This is showing the number of persons increasing over time. And this is just data broken down into genders, so male and females, and both of the genders going up from 2003 to 2009. And this is senior Ontario data in 2010 showing that falls led to almost 2,000 deaths, 41,000 hospital admissions, 400,000 emerge visits, and 2.8 million in costs. So this is a significant issue. And so just a little bit about the background of where this study came from and why they're comparing these different techniques. So there was a randomized controlled trial published in the Journal of American Geriatric Society in 2007. And this was looked at, so titled Randomized Controlled Trial of Tai Chi for Prevention of Falls, the Central Sydney Tai Chi Trial. And the objective of this study was to determine the effectiveness of a 16-week Tai Chi program in the community in reducing falls and improving balance in people over the age of 60. This was a randomized control trial with a waiting list control group, so the control group eventually participated. It was in Sydney, Australia, and included 702 relatively healthy community-dwelling adults over the age of 60. It was a 16-week program with 1 hour per week of Tai Chi, and their primary outcome was falls at 16 weeks. And their secondary outcome was falls at 24 weeks, and they also looked at 6 balance tests at 16 weeks as part of their secondary outcome. They included patients over the age of 60 that were living in the community and those that had not practiced Tai Chi over the previous 12 months. They excluded patients with degenerative neurological conditions such as Parkinson's, dementia, severely debilitating stroke, severe arthritis, or marked vision impairment, and if they were not able to walk across the room unaided. So in this study, this might be hard to see, but they had about, in the intervention group, about 353 patients. Of that, 347 completed the falls data, and in the control group, 349, of which 337 completed the study. What they, looking at their table 3 and the highlighted unadjusted and adjusted, as well as at 24 weeks, which is their secondary outcome, they concluded, their results showed that the falls rate was lower in the Tai Chi group than in the control group. So it did not meet statistical significance at the 16-week mark, which was their primary outcome, because the confidence interval overlaps, but at the 24-week outcome, which is their secondary outcome, it did meet significance. And they noted that it didn't make a difference whether patients had more than 1 falls or 2 falls. This is their secondary outcome, looking at balance measures, and they noted that there was statistical significant difference in changes in balance, favoring the Tai Chi group for sway, lateral stability, coordinated stability score, and reaction time. And so with this study, they concluded that participation in once-a-week Tai Chi class for 16 weeks can prevent falls in relatively healthy community-dwelling older adults. And another study, again published in the Journal of American Society in 2003, titled The Effect of Group Exercise on Physical Functioning and Falls in Frail Older People Living in Retirement Villages. This is also a randomized controlled trial. And the objective of this study was to determine whether a 12-month program of group exercise can improve physical functioning and reduce the rate of falling in frail older people. This was a cluster randomized controlled trial of 12-month duration. And the setting, again, was retirement villages in Sydney and Wollongong, Australia. And they had about 551 people aged 62 to 95 who were living in self and intermediate care retirement villages. And they measured accidental falls, stepping reaction time, 6-minute walk distance, postural sway, leaning balance, simple reaction time, and lower limb muscle strength. In this study, they excluded patients with an MMSE less than 20, any medical condition involving neuromuscular, skeletal, or cardiovascular system. If they were in the hospital or away from the village at the time of the recruitment, or they were already attending an exercise class that was of equivalent intensity. So with this exercise program, they wanted to fulfill 2 criteria. So they wanted to address the major risk of falls, and they wanted to improve the subject's ability to undertake ADLs. And this was done twice weekly for 12 months. Each class was about an hour, a 5 to 15-minute warm-up period, which included slow to moderate pacing, paced walking, about 35 to 40 minutes of conditioning periods, so aerobic exercise, specific strengthening exercises and activities of balance, hand-eye and foot coordination, and flexibility. And subsequently, a 10-minute cool-down period, which included relaxation and breathing. In this study, they had about 280 in the intervention group, of which 259 completed the study, and 271 in the control group, of which 249 completed the study. This is their table 3, which indicates that after adjusting for age and sex, there were 22% fewer falls during the trial in the group exercise versus the combined controls here for all subjects. And for previous patients that had previously fallen in the past 6 months or so, they had a 31% fewer falls in the 173 who had fallen in the past year. So they concluded that group exercise can prevent falls and maintain physical functioning in frail older people. So this study combines both of those techniques, and it looks at the effectiveness of the therapeutic Taiji Chuan intervention versus a multimodal exercise intervention to prevent falls among older adults at high risk of falling. And this is, like I said, a randomized clinical trial published in the JAMA Internal Medicine in October of last year. Their study objective was to compare the effectiveness of the 2 interventions, therapeutically tailored Taiji Chuan exercise and multimodal exercise relative to stretching exercise in reducing the incidence of falls in older adults at high risk of falling. The study design, it's a single blind parallel design randomized clinical trial with participants randomly allocated to one of 3 active arms. In this type of study, it's difficult to double blind because the participant is actually participating in the exercise form. So it was a single blind study. The arms included the Taiji Chuan arm, which entailed modified Taiji Chuan forms derived from Tai Chi and therapeutic movement exercises. The multimodal group looked at integrating aerobic, strength, balance, and flexibility activities and stretching exercise serving as a minimal practice standard, which was their control arm. And the population was community dwelling older adults living in Oregon at 7 urban and suburban cities. And they recruited from February 2018 to 15 to 2018. Their inclusion criteria included, so they had subjects over the age of 70 that met one of the following criteria. So they had to have fallen at least once in the last 12 months, and a healthcare practitioner referral indicating that they were at high risk of falls. Or they had impaired mobility as evidenced by timed up and go more than 13.5 seconds. And there's always a debate on which number for timed up and go is considered to be normal and abnormal. The other inclusion criteria is the ability to walk 1 or 2 blocks with or without an assistive device, the ability to exercise safely as determined by their healthcare practitioner, willingness to be assigned to a group and complete the 6-month intervention. They excluded patients who were already participating in structured vigorous activity or exercising more than 15 minutes daily, or participating in muscle strengthening activities on more than 2 days a week in the past 3 months. If they had an MMSE less than 20, or if they had a major medical or physical condition that would preclude exercise. Their primary outcome was incidence of falls, and this was ascertained on a monthly basis. For their primary analysis for the fall count, they used the negative binomial regression. Their secondary outcome was they looked at pre-specified secondary outcomes. One of them was functional reach, which was assessed as a maximal distance a participant could reach forward beyond their arm's length while maintaining their fixed base of support in a standing position. The instrumented timed up and go, which is an extended version of the tug, and they also assessed a walking duration in seconds. 3 subdomain time-based activities, which were sit to stand, turning, and turn and sit, stand to sit during the 14-minute walk. They also looked at short physical performance battery, which they measured with repeated chair stands, 3 increasing challenging standing balance tasks, and 4-minute speed walk, and a global cognitive function, which they measured using the MoCA. their primary outcome, like I said, was incidence of falls ascertained on a monthly basis, and they used a fall calendar diary. So basically, the participants were told to record their fall event, which they defined as when you land on the floor or the ground, or fall and hit objects like stairs or pieces of furniture by accident. So they did not in this study include near falls based on this definition, and those that sought medical attention, and they noted whether there were injurious falls with hospital admissions. Data on falls were collected starting from the date of the first intervention class and continued until 24 weeks later, or if the participant withdrew, died, or was lost to follow-up. For their randomization, eligible participants were randomized to one of the interventions with an allocation of 1:1:1 through a permuted block randomization. And permuted block technique randomizes patients between groups within a set of study participants called a block. Treatment assignments within blocks are determined so that they are random in order, but the desired allocation proportions are achieved exactly within each group. Their block size was 3 to 6, and I'll explain that a little bit. And this was to prevent anticipation of assignment to study condition. So for simplicity's sake, just to explain permutation block randomization, and I'm no means an expert, so if anybody want to correct me, please feel free. But for this simplicity's sake, let's assume that there are two treatment groups, A and B, and you pick a block size of 4 randomly. And so the possible arrangements here that includes the same number of treatment group A and B through a factorial calculation would be 6. So note that in this 6 combinations, you have the exact number of A's and the exact number of B treatment groups. And then you randomly choose one of the assignments. So in this case, BAAB, and you assign subjects to 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order. So this ensures the exact number of people in each group, but it can lead to there's a potential for bias if the treatment assignments become predictable or known. So for example, if you had a block size of 2 and you knew that the first participant was assigned to treatment group A, you would by default know that the next subject would be 2. And so in order to prevent this, the technique is to alter your block sizes, and so they use block size 3 to 6 in this. The intervention protocol, they had, it was a 60-minute exercise session, 2 per week for 24 weeks. They had a 10-minute warm-up period, 40 to 45-minute core exercise, and 5 minutes of cool down. There was no additional in-home or between session exercises during any of the study periods, and to ensure consistency in delivery, the protocol was maintained throughout the 24 weeks. So the therapeutic Taiji Quan part had a core of 8 therapeutically modified exercise forms, and the exercise forms were executed through controlled self-initiated Taiji Quan-based exercises with synchronized breathing. And the Taiji Quan-based movements focused on the center of body mass with synchronized breathing. Unlike the conventional Taiji Quan practice, all exercises in this were executed through a dynamic interplay of stabilizing and destabilizing postural actions with movements, and involving unilateral weight bearing and weight shifting. During the initial 10 weeks, they had to learn this technique. The trainees that taught them the techniques, there's actually a website that's I have below, which right there that anybody can really go to and learn the techniques. It's paid, so that's the only downside. So after all therapeutic Taiji Quan forms were learned, then they did variations of 5 to 6 sets. And the exercise intensity and activity increased over the course of the 24 weeks. The multimodal exercise group, the training protocol involved aerobic exercises, which were long strides, heel to toe walking, narrow when wide-based walking, and sidestepping. Strength exercises, which were ankle dorsiflexors, knee extensors, and hip abductors. balance exercises, and flexibility. And again, this was progressive with increasing challenges. The stretching exercise group involved mostly breathing, stretching, and relaxation activities, with most in seated position. Each session had a warm-up period and a core exercise. So the warm-up was essentially arm, neck, and leg circles, trunk rotation, and light walking. And the core involved seated and standing stretches involving the upper and lower extremities, along with slow and gentle trunk rotations. Deep abdominal breathing exercises and relaxation was also part of the core. The intensity was monitored through the subjective measure as perceived, so they increased the intensity depending on the subject's subjective measure of exertion. The class instructor training for study protocols were standardized, and the time spent on training orientation again standardized. The intervention classes were held in community facilities, so at community centers, churches, and nonprofit organizations. They varied in size, and they were conducted concurrently and delivered at 15 sites. And each site, 3 interventions were separated in time to avoid cross-contamination. This is their figure 1 showing the 670 patients were randomized, 220 therapeutic Taijiquan, of which 30 were lost to follow-up, 223 to the multimodal exercise, of which 28 were lost to follow-up, and 223 to stretching, and 29 were lost to follow-up. So about 581, 87% completed all the interventions. 77% of participants attended each class. And they defined that the completing their intervention as regularly or irregularly attending classes. So their table 1 with baseline demographic characteristics, they noted no statistically significant difference between the 581 participants that completed the intervention and the 89 that did not. Looking at the half of the table 1, participants were majority female and white ethnicity, with a mean age of about 77. About more than 10% had somewhat or a lot of fear of falling. More than 25% reported at least having a fall in the past 6 months. More than 5% had at least one chronic medical condition, and more than 20% were on a medication. They did not define the type of medication, so whether this was benzodiazepine or other class of medications that might make a difference, but they didn't look at that. The cost, the intervention, both Taijiquan and the stretching, cost about $200,000 and $222,000 in the multimodal group. Their table 2, which looks at the primary outcome. So looking at the total falls, they noted that both the Taijiquan and the multimodal exercise group showed significantly lower incidence of falls compared with the stretching group, but also that in the Taijiquan group, there was a significantly lower incidence of falls compared to the multimodal. So 152 participants with falls in the Taijiquan, as opposed to 218 and 363 in the stretching exercise, a total number of falls. So it's quite, looking at the number, there's a large number of falls even with the exercise. They did not note any difference with the moderate, but there was a lower incidence of serious falls in the Taijiquan and multimodal compared to the stretching. Their secondary outcomes, which was measured at baseline 4 months and 6 months, noted a statistically significant difference in the Taijiquan versus stretching exercise and multimodal versus stretching for functional reach, for the instrumented timed up and go, which included total walking distance, sit to stand, the turning duration, and turn and stand to sit duration. For the MoCA score, there was a statistically significant difference for the Taijiquan versus stretching. But just looking at both the secondary outcomes, the confidence intervals are quite large, and so it's hard to say. But they noted that there was no difference in the Taijiquan and multimodal exercise and secondary outcomes. So with critical appraisal, were the patients randomized? Yes, they were, and randomization was concealed. Patients were similar. This study was single-blinded, but with this type of study, it's difficult to double-blind. There was an intention to treat. This was not a strictly placebo-controlled. They used the stretching exercise or minimal exercise as part of their control. They had about 13% attrition rate, which is lower than their calculated 15% to get the numbers. And they had about 77 attendance rate across the 24 weeks. The study participants were, they were community dwelling, mostly women and white ethnicity. There were fewer African American included, and we know that there's a high rate of falls in that population, which might not have been taken into account. And they did look at clinically important outcomes. So they looked, their secondary outcomes looked at, cognition and such, but not their primary. But longer follow-up, I think, would be needed because they only looked at 6 months. And are the treatment benefits worth it? I would say yes. So the strengths of this study, this was a comparison of head-to-head to evidence-based interventions in patients at high risk of falling. They did consider function and cognition as part of their secondary outcome, although it was not powered for that. And this program can be implementable in clinical practice. So the cost of it is on par with, the stretching exercise group. They have already started implementing these exercises in Oregon and possibly at other places. So that website sort of has a whole program on how to implement that. So it's implementable. The limitations is that they had a short follow-up. It's unclear if the effects last after stopping the program. They did have, again, even within the program, high rates of falls. The actual number, if you look at it, is a substantial amount of falls. They use the calendar method, and there's a potential for a recall bias with this. They didn't really record near falls, which may also be important. Significant proportions of patients were lost to follow-up by 24 weeks. This was single-blinded, and they did not, like I said, specify the type of medications that were used in different groups, which may also make a difference. So in conclusion, in community dwelling older adults at high risk of falling, 6-month Taiji-Kwan intervention when compared to the conventional stretching exercise control was effective in reducing the incidence of falls. Of the 3 exercise interventions, the Taiji-Kwan yielded the greatest reduction in the number of falls, and both the Taiji-Kwan and multimodal exercise significantly improved physical function and global cognitive function compared with the stretching exercise control. So thank you, and take any questions.
Thanks very much, Molly. That's a very interesting paper.